Welcome everybody. My name is Dan Calkins. I am a .NET engineer enthusiast. I work here in the Orem area. And I'm just going to be talking about basically Microsoft's commitment to open source a portion of their products and their framework, their .NET framework. If you have any questions, feel free to ask at any point in time. But a little bit more about me. I've been using .NET for my entire career. That's just been within about 7 years now. I got started in school, and I enjoyed it. And it's just kind of found a job afterwards. Each subsequent job after that has just been related to .NET, just since it was so easy. And you'll notice that I have on there original slides by Habib Hadarian. Last week at the Build conference that Microsoft puts on, he gave a talk called Taking .NET Cross-Platform, and a lot of the ground that he covered was right on par with what I was going to share. So I actually decided to scrap 90% of my presentation, incorporate what I had, and put it into his, so I'm giving him credit there. But what we're going to talk to today is essentially give you a small introduction to the .NET framework, explain what it used to look like before their announcement and where we are today, why and what, acquisition and setup, setting up, building and creating, deploying it, some advanced things, and I'm really going to be jumping around, so if at any point you have any questions, again, feel free to ask. Again, we're going to start with what it kind of looks like. And this is really just a small overview of what the .NET framework looks like when you break it down into pieces. Up at top, you're going to have your source code. You're going to compile it down into IL, or what's called Microsoft's intermediate language, and metadata. And essentially the common language runtime, which is often referred to as the CLR, is going to basically load your executable and run it for you. One of the challenges with working with Microsoft has been, because they have different platforms, one of the things that they started was when they released .NET Framework, it had a single platform, and with each version or new addition to a platform, they would have essentially these different targets that you could try to hit. One of the problems that stem from that is when you're working with this, you used to not be able to target multiple frameworks. So if I wanted to have a model class or a model project that I would use in ASP.NET 5 and Windows Phone or Silverlight and the desktop, I would have to have a different project for each one of those different verticals. It was really a pain to deal with and a huge hassle. A good example of that is at a previous employer, we had a database, WCF, a Windows Communication Foundation layer, and a Silverlight layer. And essentially we had to duplicate classes multiple times in each different version because of this kind of challenge with dealing with verticals and the different targets. So one of the things that Microsoft came up with was what's called a portable class library. And this will all kind of merge together, and you'll see a bigger picture later on. But with that, you could essentially target multiple different things. So if you wanted to use a Windows Phone library and target the desktop, that made it essentially unable to do so. And Microsoft having dealt with these kind of problems, what they realized is that they needed to come up with a different approach for how to handle this solution. And part of that is essentially moving forward, .NET Core will be a modular implementation, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But going over the what and the why, I'm going to tackle the what right now. This is what .NET looks like in 2015. You've got the .NET Framework 4.6, which is the next version that they're going to be releasing. On top of that, you've got WPF, Windows Forms, ASP.NET 4 and 5. On the right side, you've got .NET Core 5, and I'll focus on that in a minute. And then underneath, you've got some shared components. This is really, well, the focus I want to be making on today is a small subset of this, but I want you to understand the larger picture of this. In many cases, I would say that most of the applications that Windows are using, and a spitball from what I see in the field and what actual .NET engineers are using is going to be on the left-hand side of today. So this really affects a small subset of people who want to use .NET or are currently using .NET. But the focus today is going to be just right here in this section. And the highlighted part, basically, what is going to be enabled on Linux and macOS X is you've got the just-in-time compiler, garbage collectors, compilers themselves. You've got the core CLR, which I'm going to be focusing a little bit more. And so again, this is what is going to be your primary running on Linux and OS X. And on top of that, you've got ASP.NET. So theoretically, if you wanted to build an ASP.NET application today using the version 5, you could run it when they do release it for production on Linux or OS X. So Microsoft gives these reasons on why they did this. And I'll touch briefly on it. For developers, when they're talking about new workloads and technologies, what they're really talking about is technologies that grew up on Linux and have their maturity on Linux, things like Elasticsearch and Hadoop. These are things that Microsoft developers have been asking Microsoft for, and so Microsoft is trying to respond appropriately to those. Organizations can essentially hit new clients that needed to have a Linux version available to run. And for those chief technology officers, they can basically have a Windows server and a Linux server, be able to have a lot more flexibility and even consolidating later on if they wanted to. Those are new options that are available. From my own kind of viewpoints, I'm not really sure why it took so long to get here. One of the things that you might be aware of is the Mono project, and I'll touch briefly on that in a little bit. But Mono has been trying to challenge this concept of hitting different platforms other than Windows, and Microsoft is just kind of starting to get the ball rolling with that, and it's they're kind of late in the game, and it's as far as I'm concerned. Let's see here. So for .NET developers, these are some of the benefits. I'll just touch briefly on them that they're going to have. You'll be able to run your applications and services in Linux. You'll have first-class support in Visual Studio for developing and deploying to Linux environments, including Docker, which I'll touch a little bit later. And OS X users will be able to compile and debug on their machines using Microsoft's Visual Studio Code or even a different editor if that editor implements that. And then obviously it's open source, and you can go and view that on GitHub. For non-.NET developers, kind of my target audience here, I don't know that there really are any compelling reasons to give you that make you say, hey, I've got to use .NET from now on instead of other options like Perl, Python. All those languages are great, so this is just a new step that you can be aware of. If you want to use it for new languages, that's where I think it could be a good option for you to use. One thing I will say is if you have a lot of shared code, probably I'm not going to sway you at all during this presentation. But I wanted to make you aware of what I saw as great things for Linux guys. So how do we get the bits for running on a Linux environment or OS X? So for Windows, just real briefly, you've got Visual Studio 2015 release candidate. This is essentially Microsoft's IDE. That's lots of features, lots of different tooling for, and as well, you can just go ahead and clone the repository on GitHub and build it. Building is only a Windows option right now. For OS X, they have a tar file, which you can use. But, I mean, if you're developing on OS X, then you're going to want to use Homebrew, which is the most popular packaging mechanism. And essentially, you're going to just be able to unpackage these, or using Homebrew, grab the files and be able to run them very simply. I'm going to touch on each of these, how to do it. But for a Linux environment, you're able to develop and deploy. Similarly to the OS X, you'll be able to download a tar file. Microsoft's created a VM on the Azure Marketplace that you'll be able to run. It's an option that's available. It's actually one that's fairly easy to do. And I will just make a quick note. I'm not affiliated with Microsoft, but if you want to play on the Azure Marketplace, you can sign up for a month, and they'll give you $200 in credit. And it's easy to play for a month and then just close it all and not have to pay anything. And then lastly, using a Docker file, Microsoft's working on support for within Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, I believe, to be able to enable Docker integration or usage. And that isn't out yet, but they do hope to have it soon. But running a .NET app, just from your command line, this is essentially what it's going to look like. Core Run is a native host, obviously, but essentially it bootstraps and loads the executable. On Windows, you don't have to do that simply because it's baked in already to the operating system. For OS X on using Homebrew, it's these 4 commands, which are pretty simple. First, you're going to be tapping the D and X, which is I can't remember. I'll mention it later. But you're going to be tapping that source, and then once you're done, you'll update it. You'll install the .NET Version Manager, and then you'll run the DNX, which is essentially a bootstrapper using Kestrel. Kestrel is just a Microsoft's cross-platform web server. Anyways, this is up on GitHub, so don't worry about copying it down. But running it on Linux, and this is somewhat similar for OS X as well, if you wanted to download that tar file. This is a tar file that has a demo available that Microsoft has just put together. So you'll untar that, use the version manager again. And one thing I will make mention of is the CRLR is only running in 64-bit right now. They do plan to have 32-bit later on, but right now it's just 64-bit. And then you'll run Kestrel again. Yes?
Why would we care about 32-bit?
I don't know. Why would you? I think Microsoft just wants to make it available since it's what they have on their Windows platform.
It might have to do with the embedded industry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely embedded because the small, stuff that you play around with, like Arduinos.
But I would typically agree with you. Why would you want to say 32-bit? Yeah, embedded is an issue.
Sometimes you have to issue both so that you can have compatibility with older systems.
Right.
Not just
Unless you're a jerk like me and I don't care to support that. I'll be the only app I work on a 32-bit app.
And I will just make mention, I'm not a Linux guy. I wouldn't claim to know Linux hardly at all. But a lot of this stuff, if you don't know it, and I'm not, again, not really the target market, but for anybody watching, if you don't know it, this is all up on GitHub, so you can follow their tutorials, and so you don't have to really know Linux to be able to run this. For creating and building after you've gotten those bits, what are you going to basically can you run with? Microsoft right now is pushing what they released last week called Visual Studio Code. If you were in the TypeScript talk yesterday, there was a small demo in it. They didn't give a demo, but they were using it inside of it. But basically, you can use any editor that you'd like to be using on whatever platform you can. They're going to be pushing the ability to use debugging within the Visual Studio Code. If your other editors might be a little lagging behind for that support. So if you need to debug, code is probably a good option. Yeah.
Yeah, Xamarin Studio, what used to be mono-develop, also has a pretty mature, development environment for Mac and Linux right now as well.
Yes, yeah, that's a great point to note out. All right. So I was going to do a demo real quick of basically pushing an application to Docker. And yesterday this didn't work since... let's see if I can make it work. All right. So what we have, and I know you can't really see this well, I'll see if I can blow it up. But essentially, you're going to be publishing this item. I've already set up this Docker experience, or this Docker VM beforehand. But it's essentially pretty easy. You do have to install an extension for Visual Studio. Oh, thanks, Microsoft. You do have to install an extension, but regardless of that, it's pretty easy to use. We'll see if that does actually work. But you can just go in, and this is part of your Azure subscription. You'll be able to do this. If I had one, if it could find it, because I'm not signed in, it would find it there. But let's go ahead and try to publish this real quick, and it failed out on me yesterday. So we'll see if it actually does work. A lot of this, I will note, Microsoft says this is essentially very beta right now. This is not something you want to use in a production environment, but you can play around with it and test it out. And I do believe it failed right there. So again, this worked during the presentation that they did last week at Build, but I couldn't get it to work very quickly. But regardless, this would essentially handle everything that you'd use with Docker. It packages it up, sends it up. I don't know Docker at all, so that's my generic terms for what you would do with Docker. Now, when you're running an ASP.NET 5 application, so the DNX, well, here was the note. The .NET execution environment, again, it's just a bootstrapper for Kestrel. And on Windows, you have the IIS, essentially just to make this compatible cross-platform. They built this Kestrel. I'm not certain why they didn't go with other opportunities, Apache or whatnot. But I think just to keep all their code in-house, they went with this just to make it easier for them. But it can run alongside IIS in Windows if you do Windows development. Now, one of the things that they talked about that I'll just mention real briefly, if you developers had been asking about how to use data, what changes do we have to make to our database communication, and Microsoft's answer is essentially you don't. You can, if you use SQL Server, it won't be available on Linux, so you'll still have to have a Windows server hosting that. Or if you use a cloud product, it should still just work the same. But the big point that I saw from this was that they are considering additional data providers in the future. I would say this is at least a year out, but it does give me hope that they might use some NoSQL type databases, kind of like Mongo, in the future. Yeah.
There's .NET bindings for almost every database source out there, so
Well, this is from their official release build, so they might bring in some of those third parties under their kind of official
Well,
umbrella.
I mean, it's probably close to a NuGet package away. to
Right.
support it, so.
Yeah, and a lot of the times, almost all those providers have NuGet packages available. So this is just, again, kind of that official umbrella that they offer and support, and it will work once it's out in production. So this is the code, and I will open it up here in a minute. But this is the new IDE that Microsoft is pushing. And the key here is that you'll have debugging support for .NET apps, which is really what they're trying to push. Again, like the gentleman over here mentioned, Mono has a really good IDE that they have, that's built by Xamarin, and Xamarin is a separate company that partners with Microsoft. They have a really good IDE that I've used on my own Mac here, and it works great. There isn't really any issues. But this is what Microsoft's trying to push to get you to use it. Yeah.
Keep in mind that the downside to this is it doesn't understand solutions or project files.
That is correct.
It's effectively the Atom editor with a couple plugins.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's
coming from a Visual Studio standpoint, this is going to be a entirely new IDE. There's not really any crossover between those two products. So you're going to need to be aware that, this is really a brand new IDE that you can't. You'll be able to use the source code files, .cs files or whatnot. But again, not going to have any. And if you'd like, I can pull up a demo. Is anybody interested in seeing the actual product real quick?
Question, I want to see the demo too, but is this thing open source as well?
I don't know that.
It's mixed because it's based on Roslyn and OmniSharp largely, and Roslyn's open source. It uses Mono on the back end, which is open source. So OmniSharp, Roslyn, and Mono are all open source. Atom's shell's open source, so it's probably some of the integration points that might not be open source. But again, it's the Atom shell with plugins, and all that's largely open source. So it might be an initial skinny and cutting it.
I'll just show you that real quick. But this is the editor. Let's see. Blow that up at all? There we go. Yeah, again, if you've seen Visual Studio at all, this is a very separate idea. But you've got files, searching capability, just some very simple abilities over here. Let's see. You have a Git provider that you can use. Any debugging is available. Debugging isn't supported right now, but it will be in the future for this. Again, it's an option that if you're out there, but it may not be the right one for you if you're going to be developing. So as far as deployment is concerned, if you're familiar with Xcopy, probably are. Let's see. Yeah, you can use Xcopy to deploy. You gentlemen can read this. But the key point that I wanted to make is that bottom bullet, which is no need for a machine-wide deployment of .NET. And that's where I mentioned this is a modular implementation of .NET. So instead of, with Windows, having to install the latest .NET version, you're able to just bundle it with your app and use it. That means that if you have two different applications that need to target different versions when they come out with later versions that you'll be able to target on Linux, you'll be able to do that seamlessly on the same server and not have any conflicts or issues. So that's the good point that I wanted to make out right there. So I mentioned previously the Azure and being able to play on it. They've actually built a VM that you can go out on the marketplace and install today and play around with. I didn't have a chance to do it yesterday, but it's there, it's easy, and part of their Azure solution is to make it very easy for you to just click a few buttons and have something in front of you that you can use. So you can go out, and this may not even be the most up-to-date version because this is a picture from last week, but they update it fairly regularly, and so you'll be able to go out and grab this quickly and be able to use this. It's great, again, where that $200 credit comes in, you can go out, play with this, and then shut it down and kill it later on when you're done. So containers is a new topic for me because I'm a .NET guy, and this isn't anywhere in it. But Visual Studio is going to be providing support for Docker with publishing. This is where, again, it's in a beta, but if that demo I had showed you previously would work, you will be able to do this in a very easy fashion. So it's something to be aware of that Microsoft is trying to play a lot more friendly with things that are widely in use. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the future where Microsoft is trying to incorporate things that developers are using very widely, but maybe perhaps not on a Windows environment. One of the last chapters before I do a wrap up. So I talked about building .NET from the source code. You can do this today if you have a Windows machine. These are all really easy environments. I'm not sure what CMake is, but you got to get that and download and install it. This build command is part of the repository, so all you need to do is get the source and run that, and you'll have it available. I'm not sure how long it'll take, but it will be available, and both of those are very easily done. They've tried to make it as easy and seamless for you to use and to go out and be able to have this. Yeah.
CMake is awesome. It's cross-platform, and it's really nice to use it for.
What is it?
It's like a bank replacement, only it's easier to use than secondary bank.
Okay.
A lot easier, and it does, I haven't seen that, what is it, like automate type stuff as well.
Great. No, good to know. Let's see. So this is the .NET Core repository on GitHub, and I will make mention that everything that they have open source is on GitHub today. They put it out there, and they've been adding more and more to it as time goes on.
Why not code plans?
So one of the people asked the presenter that, and his response was essentially, CodeBlocks is good, but people, in my interpretation of his response was, people aren't really using it outside of Windows developers. And so if you're trying to make this available for Linux guys and OS X guys, it really doesn't make sense to not put it up on CodeBlocks.
Also, part of the thing is most of your open source related projects, communities are gathered around GitHub. GitHub's kind of won that space.
Well, I'm a Linux guy who just barely got into Windows a few months ago. Playing with a lot of different Oron and Pascal technologies, use .NET, because of the dynamic loading needs for that system. So .NET is, Coldplex I only discovered.
You discovered just in time to watch it get completely phased out.
Yes, it will die.
It'd be like discovering SourceForge 5 years ago.
10 years ago.
I'm being generous.
And one thing that they do have in Visual Studio right now is they do have Git providers, but they are using GitHub as a first-class citizen in Visual Studio. So if you're using it, it makes it even easier to have, rather than having, an installation of GitHub for Windows running with that. You can just get rid of the GitHub desktop application altogether and use it as a first-class citizen. It's just something to make note of. And again, they do mention that they have a lot of projects up on GitHub right now, and if you were to open it up, you could see all those.
What's their community been like? They have a lot of contributions. Do they have mailing lists?
They do have a lot of contributions. I'm not sure about mailing lists.
It's pretty solid. It's actually really cool. I would argue that Microsoft has successfully created one of the best open source projects out there as far as getting people out. If you go and search, there's a really good article on like their response rate to issues, the number of pull requests they've accepted, kind of a review of the last year. And they probably have one of the lowest response rates to issues, pull requests, you name it.
You best response rates?
Lowest time.
Okay.
I think their average is like, if you were to post an issue, I think the average is like an hour and a half response window. So it's pretty amazing what they've been able to pull off, considering who they are and where they've come from. Yeah, it's actually a really neat ecosystem. I don't know, there's a lot of people on Jabber, but the Gitter.im stuff is getting very popular. And I know that, so I know a lot of their core developers are active on Jabber and also Gitter.im. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's basically an IM that's superimposed on top of GitHub, and the channels are based on repositories. So it's like gitter.im / CoreCL. No, it's like .dotnet / CoreCL or something. They have a link on their GitHub page that says join chat. And that's pretty active. I've been impressed with following the project.
Yeah, I would certainly say my gut reaction, not having participated, is they're really committed to making this work.
And C# 7 language spec is being defined and on GitHub. So if you go on GitHub under Rosalind, you can go and contribute to the next C# 7 spec. That's how open and transparent it's become.
One thing he mentions, calling native APIs from .NET on Linux is super easy. They've taken care of all the difficult stuff for you. You're just going to do a DLL import, from a C++ library that might be available on Linux, and you can just call it. It's the same as pinvoke if you're familiar with that from Windows. Super simple. Just wanted to make mention of that. Wrapping up, he talks about where we are today. Again, he makes mention, this is an eval, this is beta, this is not going to work some of the times like we saw in our demo. But theoretically, if you can create those ASP.NET 5 applications, you can run them when it hits production on a Linux or OS X. And they talk about using the remote debugging from Visual Studio will be available at a later time for debugging on a Linux box when you're still in Windows. Local debugging and production readiness. They wanted to hit that, drive that hard, that when they release this, it will be solid, even if right now it isn't. Yeah?
Are they predicting when they think it's going to be productive?
No, from what I've read and heard, I haven't seen a good timeline. I'm hoping by the end of this year. I don't know if that'll be true. I would probably guess spring of next year is when we'll start to see some of this. They make mention of a plan of record. Basically what they're going to have for sure at the time that they release their version to the manufacturers for installing the next Windows or whatnot. I'm not going to touch on those because I've touched on pretty much all of those. But these are what they're committed to. We talked about, I did mention that they have that demo available, but what they're testing on right now is Ubuntu 14, and they're not ready to call it supported yet, but it will be supported and verified soon, shortly, I would say within the month, or within a couple of weeks, that they'll be able to say, yeah, Ubuntu 14 is solid, so you can start playing on that. And I had previously mentioned Mono, but now is when I want to spend a little bit more time on that. So if you're not familiar with Mono, it's cross-platform development using C# for iOS or Android. And Microsoft likes the Mono project, and they are contributing to it, and they are pulling some of the code that is available from the Mono project. But they've kind of identified that Mono isn't ready for production grade server cloud scenarios. So for this portion right now, they're kind of moving in a different direction. But one thing I am hopeful of, I should say, is that Mono is a great project for the different clients and the different platforms. Hopefully we'll see that they start to pull that technology in to their own, and then you'll be able to just develop for iOS, even on a Windows box concurrently.
You can currently.
You can.
There's Apple limitations, not .NET limitations.
Right, and you can develop for those, like you mentioned. And Xamarin has great support for within Visual Studio. I'm kind of just hoping that this will all come under the same umbrella and be called one thing, and when you install it, it'll install everything. Part of it does install with Visual Studio, but there still can be some things you need to be aware of when you're developing Mono. I'm just hoping that later on we'll see that Mono essentially gets sucked into all their open source code and it becomes a Microsoft committed project. Right now it still is just there and on its own path. So if you wanted to use .NET on Linux, there's couple of things you can do. You can create a brand new project. Again, you can evaluate this Parts Unlimited web project that they have. It's just simply a car part shopping website, but it is available and the source code is out there. If you're moving to Linux, probably not for this target, but just basically getting to ASP.NET 5 and you'll be ready to go when that time hits. So what can you do from here? Essentially, you're going to be wanting to download the .NET Core, ASP.5. You can get those tar files. These are, again, the demo ones because you aren't able to build. You can't use anything but a demo project right now. And they will be adding that support later on, like I mentioned previously. You can go get code. This is the Docker tool that I mentioned, which isn't working, obviously. But, I mean, all these steps are available for you to use. If you really want to just get started, I would say go out to GitHub and search for .NET as one word, and you'll be able to see everything that the .NET Foundation has open source, and they have lots of projects that are available today that you can go out and play with, make changes to, do all the things that you do on GitHub. Any questions? That's pretty much all I've got.
I just want to make a quick distinction. When you're talking about apps, you're talking about web apps, not desktop
Yes,
applications.
I'm sorry, web apps. Yeah, in case you didn't understand from the small sliver that I talked about earlier on, this is just focused on ASP.NET 5. You can run console applications on Linux as well, but barring Hello World, that's not a lot of useful for a lot of the time. So that's where the focus today was mostly on web apps. Anybody have any other questions? Yep.
What's your opinion on porting .NET developed apps typically on Windows today to Linux? To see people doing that?
For the most part, I would say no. I don't see people doing that. A lot of the developers today, for my own company, we don't have a need to do that. We're moving to the cloud, and to be able to run on Linux isn't a concern that we need to have anymore. If this was 5 years ago when the cloud maybe wasn't ready or not a lot of people were moving to it, this might be a great option for us to do some expansion of our servers to have Windows and Linux available. But yeah, for my own sake, I don't see using this very necessarily unless I really have a need for it, unless I'm building a product that a client demands it.
I was just wondering, did they mention anything about performance? Have they noticed anything a little bit faster or slower on that end?
No, they haven't talked about performance yet. Because it is in such a beta mode right now, I don't think they're going to talk about that until they get a lot closer to their production release. All right, if that's it, I will end you guys 5 minutes early, unlike the last class. So thank you for coming out.